So yes, just to move on to Octavia, just to tell you a little bit. Octavia is just going to present on the experiences of being an artist in lockdown, personal experiences of a residency in the pandemic. So Dr. Octavia Cade is a New Zealand writer. She has a PhD in science communication and was the Massey University Square Edge writer in residence in 2020. Her academic work addresses the effects of isolation on art and has been published in Ecological Entanglements in the Anthropocene and Scandinavica. Given her experiences as an artist in lockdown, this topic is one that she's planning to explore further in the future. So if I could just hand over to Octavia.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? So, yeah, good. Well, hello from New Zealand, where it's about 1 a.m. So it's nice to see you all. As Tom just said, I'm a science communicator primarily. My background also is in science, mostly sort of biology, marine botany, that sort of thing. Last year, I was the Massey University Square Edge writer in residence, which means basically that in the Square Edge Community Arts Centre in the very centre of the city, where all the artists congregated and had their studios and workshops, there's a flat that they reserve for the artists in residence. I also had an office at the university in the English and Media Studies department, but I never saw the office because we had COVID. I arrived for my residency on the 21st of March last year. It was in Palmerston North, which was a city that I'd only ever just passed through. So I wasn't familiar at all. And literally 3 days after I got there, the country went into full-scale lockdown. New Zealand's lockdown was the strictest really in the world. For close to 6 weeks, it was stay at home, do nothing. You can go to the supermarket so that you don't starve. You may go out for a walk, once a day, as long as you keep distance from other people. You can't really go see your neighbours. You can't go and see your family. You stay inside. That's it. And so the Square Edge people and Matt were quite worried, frankly, that that my residency would be quite difficult. They gave me the option to go home, and they were honestly quite emphatic that I should probably take up that option. I did not. I chose to stay. I had about 48 hours to decide, to convince them that I should stay. I did. There were 2 reasons, I think, that I chose to. The first was spite, essentially. I'd been waiting about 1.5 years for that residency. It was the first artist residency I'd ever had, and I wasn't going to give it up, not for COVID. They were going to have to drag it from my cold, dead hands, basically. The second reason was curiosity. It was, could I take it? It's a very experimental approach. And, coming from that scientific background, I liked, this hypothesis. Could I do this without cracking up, essentially? How confident was I in my mental health? How much could I create during this very strange and rather eerie residency? I mean, I've had 3 residencies now, and that first one was by far the strangest. So I was fairly confident that I could do it. But, I wondered, as you would in that situation, would I be lonely? Would I be frightened? How destabilizing would it be? What effect would this have on my writing? Which seems a very selfish approach to a disease that was coming in and, killing off some of my country people. But I think sometimes you have to focus on that level of selfishness in order to survive these very odd, intermittently traumatic events, because as much as lockdown was traumatic in its way, let's be honest, I wasn't at the hospital on a respirator. I was in a comfortable flat with internet. So my experience of isolation was somehow sort of mitigated by that. But it has a very odd effect on creativity. afterwards, when lockdown was over, I was talking to a lot of other writers and other artists that I knew in New Zealand, and the effects were kind of split. About half of them were enormously productive over this time. They said they had nothing else to do and they wanted to concentrate on something that wasn't disease. And so they just went for it. The other half did nothing. They said they just took the time to navigate that brain space without putting extra pressure on themselves. So it's a very interesting split. But as I said, it was also quite isolating with some exceptions. I mean, when I decided to stay at Square Edge in the residency flat there, it was made clear to me that I was basically doing it at my own risk. I had to email the people at Massey and the Art Centre every day. I called them the I'm not dead emails, which was, you know, just so they knew I hadn't, you know, cracked up and wasn't sobbing in a wardrobe somewhere. Mostly I resorted to telling them increasingly revolting animal facts as a sort of revenge for making me check in every day, which, as spite is a frequent motivator, I'm sorry to say. But there were also other, you know, other exceptions to this isolation. You could go, you know, once a week to the supermarket. You could go for a walk around the park. The Square Edge Art Centre was on the edge of this rather large park in the middle of the city. It takes, you know, 10, 15 minutes to walk around. Now, that would be sort of the experience of nature to get you out to help sort of maintain your mental health during an experience like this. Now, I told the people in my daily emails that I was doing this every day. I was lying my ass off. I went once. Partly because I'm just sort of really lazy when it comes to exercise, but, you know, partly it was this deliberate experience of enclosure that I was looking for. When I was talking about, remember, curiosity, this desire to experiment, I was just really curious, how isolated could I make myself and still, you know, function as a creative person? It was almost reminiscent of life as an anchorite, really, as I chose to think of it. A very deliberate sort of isolation, and the art centre was right next to a church. And so from the two main rooms that I was living in, this enormous sort of steeple was looming over. So it had that very religious sense of isolation, which is odd as I'm not a religious person. But if I was thinking of sort of religion as communing with the ideal, then in this case, the ideal was that of isolation, and it was rapidly becoming an idealism of nature. The first week that I was there, I saw a moorpork. You probably don't know what moorporks are. They're a very small native owl in New Zealand. They're a ruru. The ruru is the Maori name for them. I don't see them often. I don't think I've ever seen one in the feather before, in the flesh. And one night I was just lying in bed looking up at the steeple, and the little owl came and perched on the outside of the window and started staring in. Now, in Maori culture, which, you know, I'm not Maori, but these things sort of seep through the New Zealand culture, the moorpork is a harbinger of death. Not mine, because I was frankly too self-interested to succumb to any sort of anything like that, and frankly I'm as superstitious as a stone. But it was still a confronting image. So I went searching on the internet for, you know, more ideas about this moorpork. And it turns out that despite this popular image of it being, you know, the harbinger of death, it also was known to act as a sort of kaitiaki, which means guardian. It's a forewarning of grief and awareness. And I would spend much of my lockdown time there writing about grief, ecological grief, basically. Because we were all isolated, not just from each other, but from nature. And that, I think, was the most destabilizing thing of being in lockdown, of being an artist in lockdown. So New Zealand was not only very geographically isolated, But we were also quite insulated from the effects of the pandemic, partly because we were given a lot of knowledge. Every day at 1 p.m. there was a briefing from, our Prime Minister and the person in charge of public health. And all those were very well put together, very clear, very designed to minimise panic and worry. And they worked. The whole country watched them every day at 1 p.m. And there was also a great deal of sort of community pull together. There was very little complaining about wearing masks or, I shouldn't have to stay at home, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's pretty much realised that we had to do this quite hard for perhaps 6 weeks, and then, we wouldn't have to do it again. So the effects of the pandemic weren't isolating so much as the isolation, I think, from nature. Coming back to that idea of the anchorite, I think, this walled-in concentration of the self away from the rest of the world, how voluntary it was. Lockdown, in a way, was this sort of experience in miniature of wider environmental actions, this internal experience of the external. All we were seeing was, out of my window, was birds, the moorpork, the gulls, the pigeons. And other people were feeling the same way. All the news articles started coming out of people watching, nature cams, how the nature cams at parks and preserves and zoos. We're suddenly seeing giant upswings in the amount of people who were watching them. The New Zealand example, we have an albatross colony down in Dunedin. Every bird there is named, and you can watch them on the live cam. And people were, because it was a way of reaching out to nature when they couldn't experience it in their day-to-day lives. This idea that we couldn't connect with nature anymore, that so much of our natural experience had to be sort of mediated through virtual reality was, quite confronting. And if we are sort of thinking of this moorpork as a forewarning, we live in a world where biodiversity is decreasing. Climate change is having drastic effects on the, on the amount of species that we live around us. Just today, there was something come out of California that warming waters are basically killing off the endangered Chinook salmon in the Sacramento River. And in 2019 and 2020, the breeding season for the little blue penguin in Wellington, about a third of the chicks died of starvation because the water in Wellington Harbour is warming, which means less fish, which means less food for the penguins, which means their population is, decreasing. So during lockdown, when we were all becoming these sort of anchorite creatures, it's almost a prefiguring of what society might be like in the future and how we interact with nature. Except with this biodiversity loss, we are increasing the size of our anchor houses. Instead of being small enclosed individuals during, a limited lockdown, we are becoming a species with larger enclosed spaces with less species in it, an isolated species in a less diverse world. And so this time I spent writing about ecological grief. The book I produced during that time, The Impossible Resurrection of Grief, was all about ecological grief, the way that the world is changing around us, the loss of things like the Great Barrier Reef, which is undergoing massive bleaching events. The loss of the Amazon rainforest, which in places is tipping over into savanna. At the moment, just in the past few days, it's come out that that rainforest is emitting more carbon dioxide now in parts than it absorbs. There's a dead patch in the Gulf of Oman, the size of Scotland. These are all things that people in these regions grow up with. They grow up interacting with these plants and animals. They're part of their lives. And when these things disappear, I think we begin to see an awful lot of ecological grief, and it's coming out too in a lot of the academic literature. The way that people interact now with nature is changing because the things that they used to interact with are leaving. essentially. And this book of mine has been described as sort of dystopia or post-apocalyptic, but for a lot of these species, the apocalypse has already happened. I mean, especially if you look at it in a New Zealand context. And New Zealand was one of the last, well, it was the last major landmass to be colonised. And a lot of our birds were very specialised. The kiwi, the kakapo, we had a lot of flightless animals. And so when colonisation came, it was apocalypse for these birds, and they have barely survived. There was a particularly interesting example of the kakapo. You may not know it, it's our flightless parrot. It's the largest parrot in the world. It's a bit thick. There's only about 200 of them left. And the year before COVID came to New Zealand, the kakapo had a pandemic of their own. Aspergillosis spread through their population. It's a respiratory disease. At its height, about a quarter of the kakapo population was in managed isolation. People had to wear masks around them. They had protective gear to deal with the kakapo to keep the infection from spreading. One of the most, I think, charming details, if such a thing can be called charming, is that the best way to get medicine into the kakapo was to use paediatric nebulizers. But New Zealand is a small country. We don't have a whole lot of paediatric nebulizers, so we sort of had to share between the children and the kakapo, which I think if you are looking for boundaries in crisis, that is a really interesting thing, sharing of medical equipment across species. And if the kakapo are sort of this forerunner of disease, they had their pandemic before we had ours, and it was a really dreadful disease for them. 5% of the population of kakapo died, basically. So it's quite interesting to me that the kakapo pandemic prefigured the human pandemic. And it makes me wonder if the kakapo apocalypse, which they are living essentially right now, they are post-apocalyptic creatures, is prefiguring an apocalypse of our own. I'm a science fiction writer mostly, so I think a lot about apocalypse and ecological devastation. But I'm also aware that if these creatures, these non-human creatures, are living in a post-apocalyptic world, then we are not yet. We are, fundamentally pre-apocalyptic at the moment. The Great Barrier Reef is dying, but it isn't dead yet. We can mourn for individual polar bears when we see them, starving on videos, but the species isn't gone yet. So that mourning to me is a very interesting thing. What we mourn, why we mourn it. I have a great deal of attachment to the Great Barrier Reef. I'm a marine biologist by training. I've never been there. I don't know if I'll ever go there. But if that reef dies, that is, I think, a wound that will stick with me forever. And I'm constantly in a balance with myself when I write about things like the reef, because I'm aware of how much I want to see it. But I also know that to get to see it, I'll have to fly there. And by flying, tip it a little closer to being destroyed in the first place. So this is this constant balancing act. How much can I justify to myself the desire to see this thing, and how much can I justify in fiction, exploiting it to, get what I want, essentially. So that was something I was writing about in lockdown, the idea of the Great Barrier Reef and how its potential destruction could impact on the grief we feel for the ecology around us. Because in a very real way, my country is still in lockdown. I mean, life is essentially normal here, but our borders are shut. And so I think for all of us too, in a number of ways, are still in lockdown. We talk about being out of bounds at this conference. Lockdown, the experience of lockdown is seeping over boundaries. It's imprinting the poverty and isolation of itself over the natural world and over our relationships with it. I mean, do we really want to be ecological anchorites? It's interesting to be so for a short time. It's creatively challenging, but is it sustainable in the long term? I don't think so. And that perhaps was what the Morpork might have told me, or what I might have expected it to tell me, or something like it, when I shut myself up in search of this creative isolation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Octavia and Karen, for those two brilliant talks that really, we've thrown so many ideas out here now. I think I'd imagine there are so many questions for this coming through.